who is visiting us from Berkeley. Her degree is a bachelor's degree from the University of Oregon in psychology. She got her PhD from UCLA in 2013, I'm sorry. And she's currently, I just realized I have my glasses on, which is why I can't see. It's like, she's currently a postdoctoral scholar in a joint Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health and Society Scholars Program at both UC San Francisco and UC Berkeley. So she goes back and forth between the two programs. She's published 11 journal articles in really high-quality journals such as Brain, Behavior, and Immunity, Neuroimage, Social, Cognitive, and Affective Neuroscience, and Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience. Her work draws on theory and methods from experimental social psychology, cognitive and affective neuroscience, and psychoneuroimmunology. And it focuses on understanding how social hierarchies and negative social experiences shape neural, affective, and physiological responses in ways that may influence health and well-being. The title of her talk is Social Brains, Social Bodies, Neurobiological Consequences of Social Hierarchies. Please join me in welcoming Keely.
Thank you, Paula, so much, and thank you all for having me and inviting me to speak here today. It's a real pleasure and honor to have the opportunity to share my work with you. So I'm going to tell you about the work that I've been doing over the past several years looking at the neurobiological consequences of social hierarchies. So as you may have guessed, my title, I'm really interested in social hierarchies and social standing and how where we stand in social hierarchy influences the way that our brains and bodies respond to information. So why social hierarchies? Well, first and foremost, they're ubiquitous across developmental stage, every domain of life that we can really think about. So for just a few examples, we have to navigate adolescent cliques in high school, hierarchies in the workplace, and we're embedded in this broader societal structure that's emphasized currently, especially by inequality and increasing gaps between the haves and the have-nots. But beyond just being ubiquitous and pervasive throughout our social lives, social hierarchies also have a profound influence on our health and well-being, which is really what interested me in this topic in the first place. So there's been shown over and over again to be a strong relationship between social status and health. So these are some classic data now from a paper by Adler, Len Syme, and other colleagues, where, as you can see in this graph here, individuals who are lower in socioeconomic status tend to have greater rates of a number of different chronic diseases, including cardiovascular disease, arthritis, and even some cancers. And this translates into increased risk for greater early mortality. Again, individuals lower in socioeconomic status are at increased risk to experience early mortality at a number of given stages. And explanations for this relationship from epidemiology and public health have centered around issues related to access to quality health care or health behaviors such as smoking or exercise. And while I do think that those factors play an important role in this process, the fact that this is a linear gradient, such that sort of every step up in socioeconomic status affords better health, implies that there's really something potentially psychological going on about our experience of the world that's affecting our health and well-being. And furthermore, although the graphs that I'm showing here are based on socioeconomic status, a number of other pieces of data have been suggesting that it's really an individual's perception of where they sit in the socioeconomic hierarchy that seems to at least predict in some cases over and above the effects of their sort of objective socioeconomic status. So again, just emphasizing that there's really appears to be something psychological going on that's putting individuals lower in social status at increased risk for poor health. So just to give you a general model of my approach to this issue in question, I'm interested in social hierarchies and how where someone stands in a social hierarchy influences the way that their brain responds to social information. And I have utilized a lot of neuroimaging technology in my research at the level for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, the brain is our primary organ of appraisal of the social environment and regulation of responses. So looking down into the brain and into that level can provide useful information that's maybe sometimes out of individuals' awareness and at a more automatic level. I think imaging can also be really useful for helping us tease apart when there could be different cognitive processes leading to the same behavioral outcome. And we might not necessarily know, just based on measuring an individual's behavior, what was going on at the time of an experience that's leading to that behavior. So a couple of reasons that I've utilized imaging in my work. And I'm also interested not just in examining how social hierarchies influence our neural responses to social information, but also the implications that activation has for downstream physiological processes. Again, because I'm really interested in trying to understand the relationship between social status and health. So so this is sort of the general that I've approached in my work today, and I'll walk you through some different ways that I've utilized it. And in particular, today I'm going to address three primary questions that I've investigated in my work thus far. First, how does social status influence neural responses to social information? Second, how do the brain and the immune system respond to negative social interactions and social stressors? And again, this is sort of ultimately to serve the broader goal of understanding the relationships between status and health, but currently we just don't know that much at a basic level about the connections between the brain and the body, especially in the face of stress. So kind of starting to build from there up into looking at social hierarchies and how they might affect those responses. And then finally, how does the physiological state of the body feed back to the brain to alter our perceptions of the social world? So certainly there are connections between the brain and body, and it's not just our sort of perceptions that are driving our physiology. The physiological state can also change the way that we perceive and respond to the world. So first, how does social status influence neural responses to social information? And actually, before I get to those data, I want to just walk you through some candidate neurocognitive systems that I and others have identified in our work that seem to be important in relating to the way that we navigate the social world and social stress. So you can just keep these in mind throughout my talks. They'll keep coming up over and over again. So the first system is one that in threat and salience detection, so sort of monitoring the environment for features that are salient and relevant to a person. Oftentimes those are things that are threatening. And this system involves regions shown in red here and include the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, or DACC, the amygdala, the anterior insula. So these are regions that tend to be active when, again, we're faced with threatening or we're attending to salient features of the environment. The second system that you'll see come up is one that's involved in mentalizing or thinking about the thoughts, feelings, states, and traits of others. And this system is made up primarily of the medial shown here, so the medial prefrontal cortex, this more dorsal medial prefrontal cortex region, genital and posterior cingulate. And again, these are regions that tend to be when we're asked to think about what another person might be thinking or feeling. So we'll talk about these systems, and a mentalizing system, but I'm happy to talk about what individual regions might be doing as I feel free to ask about that. Okay, so those are the candidate, again, neurocognitive systems that you'll see come up again and again in my talk today. So first and foremost, again, I'm interested in social status and how it affects health, but first I wanted to investigate this at a more individual standing in a social hierarchy influence the way they respond to social information. And this interest was born out of research showing that lower status individuals tend to have independent self-construal and be more communally oriented. And as such, they've been shown to be more engaged in social interactions with others. And also they're better at reading the emotions of other people. So generally it appears that lower status individuals, perhaps due to this more communal, interdependent orientation, are more attentive to features of the social environment. But we knew very little about the neural underpinnings of these effects, sort of what's going on in the brain in response to social information that's leading lower status individuals to have this more communal and other-oriented orientation. And also we weren't sure how automatic they were. So in most of these studies, people were explicitly asked, what is the emotion, what emotion is this person feeling? So it wasn't clear to the extent that an individual who's lower in status kind of walking around the world and processing the social environment and thinking more about what other people might be thinking. So to answer these questions, we ran a sample of 16 students through a protocol where first they were asked to indicate where they thought they stood on this ladder. So this is an adaptation of the MacArthur social status, subjective social status measure. That's sort of the essential measure of subjective social status. We adapted it so that the ladder represented UCLA, because we thought that would be a particularly salient context for these students. So they were told that the ladder represented UCLA, at the top the people who are the best off, at the bottom the people who are the worst off, and they were asked to indicate where they thought they stood on this ladder as a measure of social status. We scanned them using functional MRI. Well, they did a couple of different trials of a task. So on the social trials of this task, participants viewed an image of another person who was age matched to them, and a description that that person supposedly had written. So this person says, "I'm excited to go to lunch with my friend because I haven't seen her in a while." So I think of this as if you ask, a checkout clerk or a barista what they're doing that weekend, or you're scrolling through your Facebook news feed, these are the types of information that you might be encountering. And we measured what was happening in the brain during trials like these compared to non-social trials. During these trials, participants again saw an image, this time of an object, and read a description of the object. And this allowed us to look at what was happening specifically when people are processing social information compared to non-social information. And specifically what we were interested in is how neural responses to these trials would vary as a function of individuals' subjective social status. So what we did was essentially looked across the entire brain what regions correlated with social status to a greater degree during these social trials. So here is what we found, which was a negative correlation between social status and neural activity in these regions of the mentalizing network. So if you remember from that previous slide, these are kind of the canonical neural regions that make up the mentalizing system. And these are the same data, just plotted in a different form. So here you see social status on the x-axis and the signal from these regions on the y-axis. And here you can really see this negative correlation between social status and neural response during these social information processing trials. So what this suggests is that lower status individuals show greater engagement of neural regions involved in mentalizing when they're processing social information. So this really fits well with that prior behavioral work that I mentioned, and suggests that it's the extent that lower status individuals may be bringing online these regions to a greater degree when they're faced with social information, and that may be causing them to be better at understanding the thoughts and feelings of others. So this is interesting, although I mentioned at the beginning of my talk that I'm really interested in the relationship between social status and health. So for our next study, we wanted to try to extend this work into an arena that we thought would be more health relevant. So to do this, we recruited 22 healthy adolescents and their parents to come to the lab. And we were interested in adolescents in this case because there's some evidence that socioeconomic status, specifically in earlier ages, is what's most predictive of adult health outcomes. So sort of regardless of what social status you ultimately achieve in your life, it's really those kind of early years that appear to drive at least relationships with health, so hence the focus on adolescents. And we had the adolescents' parents answer these two questions: what is your annual household income, and what's the highest level of education achieved by the child's mother, which we combined to form an indicator of objective socioeconomic status in this study. So a secondary goal of the study was just to look if there was kind of convergence in our subjective measure of this more local social environment that we had used in the previous study and this broader, more objective measure of socioeconomic status. Then we scanned the adolescents using fMRI while they viewed socially threatening images, like this angry face here, just compared to a fixation baseline. And again, we weren't interested too much in what was happening in the brain just during this compared to this, but specifically what was happening as it related to this objective socioeconomic status indicator. So we ran the same type of analysis that I mentioned before, where we contrasted what was happening neurally during those social information, social threat trials compared to the fixation baseline, and we looked for regions whose activity was correlated with that measure of SES. And what we found, replicating the results of the prior study I showed you, was that there was a negative correlation between socioeconomic status and activity in the DMPFC, which is shown here, which is kind of the core node of the mentalizing neural network. So this is a replication extension into a different sample, a new population, and using a different measure, again, or using a different task, again, suggesting a negative association between SES and neural responses in regions that are sensitive to the thoughts and feelings of others. We also found a negative association between socioeconomic status and neural activity in the amygdala. And the amygdala is one of the key regions in this threat-related neural system. So again, this suggests that potentially in these negative, threatening contexts, lower status individuals may show greater threat-related neural responses. So together, it appears that during social threat processing, lower status individuals show both greater activity in these mentalizing related neural regions and also in this key threat related neural region. And although we didn't have any physiological measures in the current study, what's interesting about the amygdala is that it's sort of ideally situated and has dense connections to a number of lower level brainstem regions that have been shown to be important for initiating physiological responses. So this suggests that, again, perhaps one of the contributors to the relationship between SES and health is this greater amygdala activation in response to threat, which could then start off this cascade of physiological responding that over time could contribute to poorer health outcomes. So before I move on, I just want to wrap up this line of work by telling you about some current directions I'm pursuing related to it and also some plans that I have for the future. So first, as I mentioned, I'm curious what the biological consequences of this increased mentalizing or increased attention to the thoughts and feelings of others during negative social interactions might be. And I'm going to touch on this a little bit in the second part of my talk. But again, this was all sort of at the level of looking at neural responses, and I really want to link those neural responses to downstream physiological changes. I'm also interested in exploring other measures and dimensions of social status and seeing if they have if those measures produce similar effects in terms of neural responses. So first and foremost, I think we need good experimental manipulations of social status, and one of the things that I'm looking forward to doing is experimentally inducing either a high or low status state in people and seeing if that does in fact increase the activation in these neural regions that are involved in thinking about the thoughts and feelings of others and responding to threat. I've also gotten really interested in neighborhood characteristics and how the sort of neighborhood, local environment that we live in may affect our health and well-being. So a lot of work coming out now showing that measures of community and community cohesion and also community chaos can have a profound influence on people's health and well-being. And I'm curious sort of how that manifests itself in the brain in these very minute sort of basic social interactions interactions in ways that could lead to poor health. And finally, I'm really excited to explore when mentalizing might be good for low status individuals. So if you think about it, knowing what other people are thinking and feeling is a really good skill. It's something that we want to have, and we want to be able to understand what another person is thinking, or why they're making that face. And I've showed some data that suggests that maybe this isn't always the best thing, but I think there are contexts in which it can be really good. In particular, I'm curious if we can sort of change the way that we do cognition to make it more like social cognition, to improve both educational and health outcomes of lower status individuals. So let me tell you what I mean by this. I'm going to show you some preliminary data from a study that I'm working on right now. So this is a study in which we had participants do a cognitive working memory test. This is sort of a typical task where people are asked to alphabetize a string of letters, and then after a little delay we ask them, was J the third letter we presented you? And what we find is that there's a positive correlation between social status and accuracy on this cognitive working memory task. So you can see that higher status people perform better on this cognitive working memory task. And this is replicating a lot of prior work by Martha Farah and others. Has been sort of documented over and over that lower status individuals tend to perform worse on these kind of basic cognitive tasks, including working memory. Now, what was interesting is in this study, we developed a social working memory task. So instead of keeping in mind a string of letters and having to alphabetize them, what we had participants do was rate their friends on a number of different traits. And then we would show them a trait word like funny, and they'd be shown 3 of their friends' names and asked to rank their friends according to that trait dimension. And then after a delay period, we would ask them, was Paula the third funniest in this list? So rather than keeping in mind a string of letters, they're keeping in mind social information and traits about people. So still doing a working memory task, but with social content. And what we find, interestingly, that this effect completely reverses, and instead we find a negative correlation such that lower status individuals perform more accurately on this social working memory task. Now, these are preliminary data. It's a small sample, and this is something I'm currently following up on, but I think it's at least encouraging that there may be, at least under non-threatening context, ways in which this mentalizing and social information processing advantage that lower status people have could be really put to good use. And I can think of lots of ways that we could extend this to the way that we teach math and science in the classroom, or the way that we direct our health messaging programs at lower status individuals to try to change them a bit to capitalize on this relationship. So this is one thing I'm really excited about and working on right now. Okay, so that's my work to date on this first question of how social status influences neural responses to social information. And now I want to switch gears a bit and talk about how the brain and the immune system respond to negative social interactions. And again, this is ultimately in service of trying to understand the development of health disparities and links between social status and health. But again, as I mentioned at the beginning, we just know so little at this point about the neural underpinnings and predictors of physiological changes that we wanted to start there and kind of build from there. So just going back to my diagram, I've talked about this part in the first section of my talk, and now I'm going to switch gears to talking more about this link here. So the physiological system that I've focused the most on my work to date is the immune system, and particularly inflammation. So I just wanted to give you a brief background on inflammation. So as you may know, inflammation is part of the innate immune system. It's sort of our body's first line of defense against injury or infection. And the inflammatory response is orchestrated by these proteins, which are shown here, which are called pro-inflammatory cytokines. And they are secreted by immune cells like these guys, so that when a injury happens or there's a pathogen in the body, these cytokines travel to wherever that thing is happening and call out to other immune cells to come to that site and try and help heal the wound, for example, or fight off the pathogen. So they're sort of the chemical messengers of the immune system. Now, we typically think of inflammation as occurring locally, like if you get a paper cut and you notice that the area around it on your skin is red, it heats up, it might be swollen. That's because of these pro-inflammatory cytokines coming to that site. But inflammation can also be systemic or widespread throughout the body. And interestingly, systemic inflammation has been implicated more recently in the pathophysiology of some of our most common and costly chronic diseases. So cardiovascular disease, rheumatoid arthritis are all associated with heightened levels of systemic inflammation. And interestingly, mental health conditions such as major depression and post-traumatic stress disorder are increasingly being understood as disorders that also have an inflammatory component. So I think addressing inflammation and inflammatory responses to stress might help get us one step closer to understanding risk for these chronic health conditions and also potentially mental health issues. And beyond their role in chronic disease and in helping heal wounds and infections, what I think is really interesting about cytokines as a social psychologist is that in the absence of injury or infection, so nothing wrong in the body, inflammation can be induced by purely psychological states. So social stressors, particularly threats to social status and social evaluation, have been associated with increases in levels of inflammation, as well as self-conscious emotions, particularly shame, have also been associated with increasing levels of inflammation. So why might this happen? Well, some have theorized that the inflammatory response to these purely psychological states may be a defensive reaction to possible harm. So I think when we think about the stress response, we're used to thinking about fight or flight, and cortisol responding and cardiovascular responding that really subserves this fight or flight response. And inflammation is hypothesized to be a mechanism of sort of recovery and defensiveness and recuperation, where if you don't escape that predator by fleeing or you can't fight it off, it's adaptive for the body to have this innate protection mechanism to help heal whatever wounds may have resulted. And of course, we're not running from predators much these days or engaging in too many physical altercations, but the idea is that the same systems that developed to help us cope with those types of stressors are also at play in the modern environment where we're faced with more social, psychological threats. So we know very little about the neural processes that underlie these social stress-related increases in inflammation and sort of what's happening online during a social stressor in the brain that could be contributing to these downstream changes in inflammation. So this was one of the questions I have been interested in my work, but one of the major hurdles was how we were going to induce an inflammatory response and put someone through a social stressor within the confines of the MRI scanning environment. So normally we induce a stress response in the lab by having people do essentially what I'm doing right now, give a speech in front of a panel of evaluators, and that tends to elicit, a pretty big increase in stress-related hormones and physiological processes. But while people are lying down in a scanner, we can't have them give a speech, we can't have them write about a time that they felt ashamed, so we had to get a bit creative. And to do this, we adopted a task based on some of Mark Leary's work on state self-esteem. So let me just walk you through what happens in this task. So first, participants come into the lab for a baseline session where they do an interview that's videotaped, and they think they're signing up for a study on first impressions. So during this interview, we ask them relatively personal questions like, what would you most like to change about yourself? Or tell me about a time when you really disappointed someone or let someone down. And they're told that at the next session for the study, they're going to be meeting another participant who's also doing this interview at a different date, and that we're going to choose one of them to watch the other person's interview on video and form an impression about how they are coming across in the video. Now, of course, unbeknownst to participants, the other participant is actually a research assistant who's serving as a Confederate, and it's always that we choose the participant to be the one who gets their video evaluated and sees the feedback from this other person while they're in the MRI scanner. So a few days later, the participant comes to the scanner, and it looks essentially like this. So these are actually pictures taken from my study, where we have a Confederate who's sitting out in the scanner control room, who's supposedly watching the participant's video and providing feedback about how she's coming across. And meanwhile, the participant is in the scanner, and through these MRI-compatible goggles, she's supposedly seeing what this person is thinking about her. So let me show you what it's like to be a subject in this study. This is what you'd be seeing through the goggles, this grid of adjectives and this mouse cursor that moves around the screen and selects a different adjective every 10 to 12 seconds. So 1/3 of the time the adjective is neutral, like what you just saw, sensible. 1/3 of the time it's a positive adjective, like interesting. And critically, 1/3 of the time participants get negative feedback, such as you seem insecure. They think, that the Confederate is out there controlling this mouse cursor and providing them with this feedback, when in actuality, it's a videotape and we give everyone the same feedback. This allows us to measure the neural response to these different types of feedback while participants are getting it in real time. So before I get to the results, I just want to return to these neurocognitive systems that I've been discussing, a system involved in mentalizing and one involved in responding to threat. And we were particularly interested in this study in looking at how these two systems might work together during times of stress. So this is based on some animal research which suggests that during a stressor, you do see this kind of initial threat response in the brain at the level of the amygdala and the dorsal anterior cingulate. But that's really not enough to drive physiological changes in stress. You really need these prefrontal systems, such as those in orange here, that come online and are sort of a signal to pay attention to the environment and try to figure out what's going on that's causing this threat. And then those regions kind of serve to sustain this threat-related responding in ways that ultimately lead to physiological changes. So we were interested in how these two systems might be working together during negative social evaluation. So to test this, we brought 31 students into the lab, a pretty diverse sample. They were excluded for a number of criteria that have been shown in the past to be related to either levels of inflammation or are issues for the MRI scanning environment, like being claustrophobic or having metal in their body. We also had participants complete the latter measure of subjective social status, just trying to again, understand sort of how these systems and the activation of these systems may vary depending upon one's perception of their status. I'll touch on that a bit at the end. So briefly, this is what happened. Participants showed up at the scanner. We took some baseline blood samples from them, which were